Officer down! I repeat, officer down!
Welcome back to 1033. This is your host, Nathan Kapler, a podcast created for a first responder by a first responder. If you are not a first responder, you still are welcome. This podcast is aimed directly at trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder. PTSD is complex and often misunderstood. Our brave men and women who serve our communities often end up with behavioral and psychological issues as a result of experienced trauma from their careers. My goal is to share what I know, my personal experience with PTSD as a retired police officer, and continue to advocate for mental health while providing support to those still in their careers. This podcast is not a substitute for professional medical help, and I strongly suggest if you are in fact suffering, you seek out professional medical advice. Please join me on this episode as I continue to expose the reality of PTSD challenges. I hope you enjoy this week's episode. In last week's episode, I talked about an incident involving trauma to a child, and evidently to myself and my partner as well, as we responded and had to deal with this event. We spoke about dissociation and what it is and why it happens. You see, when I first got to that call, I saw something extremely shocking and disturbing in nature. And in that moment, I actually felt like I had left my body. And as I peered through a window into this traumatizing, disturbing scene that was unfolding before my very eyes, I felt like I had left my body and was now standing on top of the roof of the building that I was at, on the outside of the building. I had become completely disconnected from myself in that brief moment and pulled away and actually believed I was looking down on myself in third person. I don't recall any specific emotion during that event. There may have been some shock intertwined with that, so maybe a bit of startled response. But overall, I actually remember this visualization, this internal vision of looking down on myself, completely void of any feeling whatsoever. I would actually say in that moment, I most likely was completely numb. I don't know how I was eventually intertwined back into my body in a more grounded state. I think that moment was actually very short-lived. I can't give you a specific time, but I would say it was probably under 1 second. I do recall, though, coming out of that disassociated state, that disconnected time, thinking to myself, I can't do that again. I actually have to be connected. I have to keep moving forward in this situation. Time is of the essence so that no one gets hurt. I can't disassociate anymore. I remember thinking all of that as I was sucked back into my body and now turning to my partner, screaming to him to kick the door. Now, disassociation itself is an incredibly normal moment in our lives. There's a reason why we experience dissociation. It's a natural defense mechanism that the body holds within, and when the body detects that something is too overwhelming, too shocking, too disturbing in nature, something that may actually physically impact you emotionally or physically, and may actually carry an immense amount of pain, the body disconnects in that moment in an attempt to control the amount of pain you may feel or for what is incoming. So now that we have a bit more awareness into why dissociation happens, it's the body's natural response to protecting you. It's nothing to be ashamed of. And I would argue that most first responders in the course of their career experience dissociation to some degree at least once. Having awareness and education into why the body does what it does is one of the most important aspects of prevention. I unfortunately did not understand or start to learn about dissociation until much later in the game, much after I had been diagnosed. Can I say that I would have appreciated to know this much earlier on in my service? Absolutely. If we can shift gears, though, in today's episode, we covered this story the last week. I wanted to touch briefly on it just to make sure that we really drive home the point of what dissociation is and where it comes from. And I spoke specifically about the event that triggered this in me quite earlier on in my policing career. But today's episode is not about that. Today's episode is actually going to be about compassion fatigue. Compassion fatigue in and of itself is a term, and I am taking this from webmd.com. It is a term that describes the physical, the emotional, and the psychological impact of helping others, often through experiences of stress or trauma. Compassion fatigue is often mistaken for burnout, which can be a cumulative sense of fatigue or dissatisfaction. Now, for me, I think over the course of my 14-year policing career with the RCMP, if I can truly reflect on my career, I believe compassion burnout happened for me more than once. Once early on in my career when I was a general duty police officer during my time in Whistler, BC, and the other time later on as a federal investigator for FSOC, which was a plainclothes position down in Vancouver, BC. I'm going to talk about the first incident, though, for right now. About 3 years into my policing career in Whistler, and I was only there for 4 years. I had to cover a shift in Pemberton, BC, which was a small community about 20 minutes north of Whistler. It was a beautiful little community. I actually have very fond memories of it and the people within. But on that morning, I think I woke up around 6 a.m., showered, put on my uniform, quickly left the house, and drove out to Pemberton in my police vehicle. I believe the start of my shift would have been around 7 a.m., and I was there on time in the community of Pemberton. But as I was rolling into this town 20 minutes after my drive had begun, I got a call from dispatch. And they had asked me to go and check a section of highway where a horse was believed to have been hit by a vehicle in the early morning hours and left in the ditch. I think by this point in my career, I was starting to develop, yes, thicker skin, but also a certain level of cynicism about the world or pessimism that existed within me. And my naturally optimistic outlook on everything was now starting to shift into a much more sinister negative outlook. Begrudgingly, I naturally took that call at that point, frustrated with the fact that I haven't even had a chance to have my breakfast yet. I was starving, but Mounties will always take that call to sacrifice their own needs. So off I went. Once I got on scene, it was very clear that the horse was in fact in the ditch. It was still alive. Before I dive into the rest of this story, I do have to also issue a trigger warning here. I'm not going to go to a place where I describe the scene in depth where it could be particularly damaging to you, the listener, but this story does end in the loss of the animal's life. Noticing the horse in the ditch, and noticing immediately while I drove by it that it was still alive, not standing but laying down with its head up, just peering over the top of the road as cars drove by. I thought to myself, this horse actually might be okay. I might be able to save it. We might be able to get it up and get it back onto its feet and get it going. Perfect, I thought. I parked my PC a short distance away. I let dispatch know that I had found the horse, and I was going to get out to try and move it along. I exited my vehicle and I walked up to the area where the horse was laying. As I approached that horse, I do actually have to take some time to describe the rest of the area that was in front of me. On the other side of that ditch, where the ground was again parallel to the surface of the road, was a large fence, and on the other side of that fence was about 10 to 15 horses that stood motionless, looking at this horse that lay motionless in the ditch. They didn't pay much attention to me when I first walked up. I found the situation to be moving in a sense, as I thought to myself, are these animals actually watching over this horse? How long have they been here for? Do they care for this horse? Do they actually have some kind of emotional depth to them where they would stand here all night looking over this horse? I continued to approach the horse slowly and cautiously. I started to talk to it with a calm voice, very quietly, and the horse had his eyes on me the entire time. Didn't move at all. Continued to lay there, but he had his head up looking at me. I had gotten close enough to know that my presence wasn't going to motivate this horse to get up, and that he was seriously hurt. For some reason, even in that moment, while we locked eyes, a few feet apart, I could almost tell that he knew that something wasn't right as well. I thought to myself, how did this happen? What had caused this horse to be completely immobilized in a ditch since the early morning hours? I quickly scanned the road and I saw a lot of debris from a vehicle. And I had been to enough hit and runs by that point that I quickly knew that someone had most likely hit this horse and left. There is a very good chance that that horse laid in that ditch in pain for hours on end, while his herd of fellow horses on the other side of the fence watched and looked over him. Fearing the worst but still optimistic, I had no idea what I was actually going to do. I wasn't a horse expert. I couldn't just naturally look at this horse and assess what was wrong with it. What were we going to do next? But as luck would have it, a farmer from, I believe, just down the road came down with a piece of equipment that had a large fork on the front of it. And I thought, perfect, he's going to help me move this horse. Maybe get this horse some help. I approached that farmer and I talked to him briefly, had told him that we had received a call about this horse and that's why we were here. And I wasn't really familiar with horses or injuries or why this horse wasn't getting up. And he took one look at me and he said, that horse is done. He most likely has some spinal injury and can no longer use his body, his legs. Still clinging to optimism, I asked him, almost pleading, there must be something we can do for him. And he said, no, unfortunately not. He will have to be put down. By that point, a female officer had showed up on scene as well. A very caring individual. I believe she too was filled with optimism and hope that something more could be done, that we could do more. I didn't know how to tell her that unfortunately I was going to have to put this horse down. I didn't want to ask her to do it because I knew of the toll that it would take on her. I was struggling in that moment to even navigate or feel my emotions that were welling up. The anger that I had for this individual that had caused this event and let this horse suffer in the ditch for hours. The sadness of knowing of what's next to come. The fear of having to go and do this to an animal. There was more emotions, I'm sure, in that moment. But I again shoved them down deep. I knew that every passing second that action was not taken, that horse continued to suffer. I walked back to my PC. I grabbed my shotgun. I loaded the bottom tube with enough rounds, and I closed the action on the shotgun, leaving the chamber empty. Almost as if to plead with myself that magically this horse would get up and spring to life as I walked close with a shotgun in my hands, hoping that this would motivate that horse so that what I had to do next wouldn't actually have to happen. As I again approached that horse, my partner looked at me, pleading with me not to do what I knew I needed to do next. I didn't know how to respond. I didn't know how to have a conversation with her in that moment and explain that this had to happen. I don't even know if I said anything in that moment. I walked past her with immense shame of being unable for myself to connect with her in that moment, to at least help her out with her own emotions. And I put everyone behind me, so I didn't have to look at them in the face and see their emotion, so that I could do the job. As I had walked up to that horse a second time, that herd of horses looked at me differently this time. It was like they screamed at me to stop what I was about to do. And they all, except for one, turned and ran away. The one that stayed behind stood on its hind legs and kicked wildly in the air in my direction. I only took this one way. If there was no fence there, he would have attacked me to stop me. I believe that. I knew in that moment that horses or animals are more than just horses and animals. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I had a front row seat to life, to the pain that animals also carry. I looked back down at that horse as he continued to look at me, and I shook my head in complete disgust. And I blamed whoever drove that car that night and hit him, causing this whole event to happen. I assumed that driver most likely had been drunk, intoxicated to the point where he couldn't stop, swerve, or avoid this poor horse. I assumed the worst. I was infuriated. I was angry. I was filled with rage for the person that had done this, who had put me in this position where I needed to finish this off. As I felt all of these feelings, I again caught myself realizing that I needed to stop feeling and do the job to end the suffering. And as soon as I shut my emotions down, that horse changed the way he looked at me. I'm not going to tell you what happens next. I believe it's safe to assume that you know what happens next. After that horse had put his head back down on the ground and turned away from me as I readied myself, it was like he didn't want to see what was coming. After that one single shot rang out, that horse that was still there, that stayed behind to protest what I was doing, suddenly turned and ran, but bucked its rear legs in my direction. The emotion in me that comes up as I tell this story is very real. It's that sadness that rocks you, that makes you feel as if it's pain, that causes your abs to clench and your body to fold, your face to scrunch and the tears to come screaming out of your eyes. The only thing you can do is put your hands in front in some attempt to hold back what is coming flooding out right now. This happened 11 years ago. I will never forget the beauty that happened in that moment, the love that was shown from these other horses as they watched over that horse, or the pain that I endured knowing that I had to take that horse's life. What I didn't recognize from that moment was that I walked away with a disgust now for human beings that made poor choices, human beings that didn't take action when they needed to, human beings that didn't own their mistakes. Giving compassion for me was done. You could say I developed a hatred for some people, and that my anger had suddenly kicked into a high gear, one that was ever present, that my irritability was now there, always on the cusp. Following that, I had tried to find the driver of that vehicle. I had seized some car parts that were on the road. I'd gone to a few locations looking for surveillance from the night before. I had most likely gone above and beyond what was required of me. But I cared so much, and I wanted to catch that person, to hold someone accountable for their actions. But alas, we never did locate who was responsible for this event. Being a police officer is one of the most challenging roles I've had in my life. One that when I entered into, I knew I had to have immense compassion for people. But as a result of this call, I don't believe I had any more left. After that, my mood swings had started to happen. Drastic shifts in mood. The pessimism, the cynicism, the cynical thoughts, they were almost cyclical in nature. I had a hard time experiencing positive emotion after that. There was immense amount of negativity in my mind. The irritability was there as well. And it was extremely quick to anger at that point. I again take ownership of this, though, in recognizing that if in that moment I would have had the time or the knowledge to sit down and explain, have a critical incident debrief, whatever the case was, but actually talk and get some of this stuff out instead of suppressing it and trying to move on, that things may have went differently. I'm not saying that compassion fatigue could have been avoided. I think with enough years in as a first responder, eventually this will hit, regardless of your knowledge or your experience or your ability to dive into your own emotions. We see so much. We feel so much. After all, we're human. How could we not? Now, years later, as I tell this story and the emotion wells up, I handle it much differently now. I allow this emotion to hit me, as hard as it needs to hit me. I own it. I talk about it. I present it. I don't suppress it anymore. I've learned how to navigate and let it happen and let it swirl in the body. And then when it's done and it's ready to leave, it leaves. And then I move on. So while these stories are incredibly hard too for you, even just to hear them, the hope that is behind recovery is there. We get through this stuff. It gets better. Last episode, I promised you I was done with my stories from Whistler. But as I sat with this week's episode of what I was going to talk about next, compassion fatigue popped into my mind. It's a very big part of policing that most of us are going to face at some point. And I knew I wasn't done with my journey into Whistler just yet, as I knew that this story most likely could help someone out there who is struggling. So instead of committing and telling myself that I'm done with my stories from Whistler and then waiting until next week and possibly remembering a different aspect of trauma I'd love to dive into and unfold for you to share, we're going to end this episode here with no expectations of the next episode, with no direction for now. I may jump into my plainclothes career that happened after general duty. I may think of something that happens over the next week and I think maybe we stay in this space for a bit longer. But as always, please take care of yourself as you listen to these hard stories. If you are struggling, reach out to your support network. If you don't have one, get one. They can include family and friends in that inner circle. They can also include professionals as well. There is no shame with having that in your life. It's a very necessary tool for success. As always, thank you for joining me on this journey and sharing with me the time that it takes to listen to my story. I appreciate each and every single one of you out there that listens and writes in and offers such kind, caring, and loving words. I will be forever grateful for each and all of you. Until next time, take care of yourself. Much love.